In 2007, Barcelona had a problem. Not because they lacked talent, not because they lacked money, but because they suddenly had two teenage superstars and they weren't sure which one was going to change football forever. One was already beginning to do exactly that. His name was Lionel Messi. The other was a boy many people inside Barcelona genuinely believed could become even bigger. He broke scoring records, destroyed youth competitions, forced coaches to promote him years ahead of schedule. At just 17 years old, he was already being compared to the greatest player of his generation. The football world called him the next Messi. But what happened next would become one of the strangest, most heartbreaking stories in modern football. Because while Messi went on to win World Cups, 8 Ballon d'Ors, and become arguably the greatest player who ever lived, the boy who was supposed to follow him vanished. This is the story of Bojan Krkic, and why football got him completely wrong. But before we get into what happened to him, you need to understand why Barcelona's scouts were genuinely asking a question that sounds ridiculous today. What if Bojan was actually better than Messi? Because in 2007, that was not a crazy question. That was a real conversation happening inside one of the biggest clubs in the world. Long before football fans knew his name, Bojan Krkic was already creating problems for youth coaches. Not because he was difficult, because he was too good. Born in 1990 in Linyola, a small town in Catalonia, to a Spanish mother and a Serbian father who had played professional football himself, Bojan entered Barcelona's La Masia academy as a child. And almost immediately, stories started spreading through the club. Every youth level looked the same. Bojan arrived, Bojan scored again, then scored so many times that the coaches had no choice but to move him up to the next age group. Defenders couldn't stop him, coaches couldn't challenge him, and records kept falling. By the time he was a teenager, Bojan had scored over 900 goals across all youth levels at Barcelona. 900 goals. In youth football, that number was so staggering that it almost didn't sound real. And the people watching him every day weren't just impressed. They were genuinely wondering whether they were looking at something unprecedented. Meanwhile, another teenager at the club named Lionel Messi was beginning his own journey into the first team. But here's the thing that made the comparison genuinely interesting at the time. Messi arrived with questions. Could his small frame survive the physicality of professional football? Could he stay healthy over a full season? Could he handle the grind of a
personality that I had in that moment was a dream, to play, and I really enjoyed to play in Camp Nou with Barca, amazing games with the amazing players, but behind this, was something that my personality, my name was very famous, and for me to deal with this was complicated.
In the 2007-08 season, Barcelona manager Rijkaard made a decision that sent shockwaves through Spanish football. He handed Bojan Krkic his first team debut. Bojan was 17 years old. He became the youngest player ever to play for Barcelona's senior side at that point, breaking a record that had stood for over 80 years. A record, to put it in perspective, that had previously belonged to Lionel Messi. And Bojan didn't just survive, he thrived. He scored on his Champions League debut. He finished that first season with 10 goals in all competitions, not as a fringe player getting the occasional cameo, but as a genuine contributor to one of the best squads in the world. The hype machine went into overdrive. Newspapers across Europe were running headlines about the next great Spanish striker. National team coaches were already mapping out his future. Sponsors were calling. Comparisons to Ronaldo, to Messi, to Van Nistelrooy, they were everywhere. And to his credit, Bojan handled the attention with a maturity that surprised people. He didn't act like a teenager drunk on fame. He trained hard, he stayed focused, he said the right things in interviews. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But something was happening beneath the surface that nobody could see yet.
My first year in Barcelona, I started bringing all the records. I was the first player, young player to play, the first young player to score. And the people say, yeah, the new Messi. This is something that you can do nothing about this. I was not the new Messi, but I'm really happy what I did and what I'm doing. Messi scored 3 goals every game. If you score 1 goal, you are not Messi. When I went to Milan, you go there not as a Bojan, you go there as a new star, as a new Messi. So there, if you go there and you play good, it's not enough. You know, that was not helping me in all my
Talked about
career.
sitting in the dressing room before matches and feeling his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with excitement.
You know.
This was not weakness. This was a teenager being crushed under the weight of a narrative he never asked for. And the painful irony is that the better he performed, the heavier the expectations got. Every goal added another layer of pressure. Every good game raised the bar for the next one. He kept playing, he kept scoring, but something fundamental had shifted. Football was no longer a game, it had become a test, one that he felt he was constantly failing, even when the scoreboard said otherwise. Part 4: The Fade, 7:30–9:30. The seasons that followed told the story in goals and loan spells. Bojan's numbers at Barcelona began to decline. He was still talented, clearly still one of the best young players in Spain. But the explosive, unstoppable force that had smashed records through La Masia, that player seemed harder and harder to find. In 2011, he left Barcelona, first on loan to Roma in Italy, then to AC Milan, then to Ajax in the Netherlands, then to Stoke City in England. Each move felt like a reset, a fresh start, a chance to rediscover what had made him special. Some moves worked better than others. At Roma, there were flashes of brilliance. At Stoke, there were moments that reminded fans of the player he had once been. But the trajectory that everyone had mapped out for him, the one where he was supposed to be challenging for Champions League titles and Ballon d'Ors by his mid-20s, never materialized. He was a good player, a solid professional, a useful squad member. That is not a failure in any normal sense. Thousands of footballers would give anything to have the career Bojan Krkić had. But against the backdrop of what he was supposed to become, every club he joined felt like a step down from where people thought he should be. Bojan Krkić retired in 2022. And in the years since, he has done something that very few footballers of his profile have done. He has talked honestly about his mental health, about the anxiety, about what it felt like to carry the weight of impossible expectations as a teenager. He has said that nobody around him, not coaches, not clubs, not the media, was equipped to understand what he was going through. Mental health support in football in the late 2000s was almost non-existent at most clubs. You were expected to perform. You were expected to cope. And if you couldn't, the assumption was that you simply weren't good enough. But Bojan was good enough. That was never the problem. The problem was that football, the clubs, the media, the entire ecosystem decided a 17-year-old boy was going to be the next Messi, and then refused to let him be anything else. He wasn't allowed to develop at his own pace. He wasn't allowed to struggle without it becoming a crisis. Every step backwards was treated as evidence that the hype had been wrong, rather than as the normal human experience of a young person figuring out who he was. And when football is done talking about Lionel Messi, the records, the trophies, the genius, it might be worth spending a little time talking about the players who got compared to him, about what that comparison cost them, about what the game asked of them and never gave back. Bojan Krkić was not a failure. He was a footballer who was handed an impossible story at 17 years old. And he did the best he could with it. The saddest part of this story is not that Bojan didn't become the next Messi. The saddest part is that nobody ever stopped to ask whether that was fair to ask of him in the first place. He scored over 900 youth goals. He broke Barcelona's all-time appearance record for the youngest debutant. He played in some of the biggest stadiums in the world before he was old enough to vote. By any reasonable measure, that is an extraordinary life in football. Football just decided it wasn't enough. If you want to see another story about a player who football got completely wrong, the next video is right there.